Hear the very colourful message of Zoom control. Kai, I'm Kevin Murray speaking to you from Naarm, Melbourne, whose traditional owners are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Finally, out of lockdown, we can enjoy Balth Garu, the grass flowering season. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and to the ancestors of the lands where you come from. And today, now with your permission, we will share our learnings over the course of the next hour. The Reinventing the Wheel series is an initiative of the Knowledge House for Craft, an association of thinkers and makers that aims to reflect the global diversity of our field. Each of these talks becomes a spoke in the wheel, a growing repository of craft knowledge, and I wish to acknowledge my colleagues in this endeavour who are present, Ben Lignell, and also I think Laila Al-Hamad is here as well, as of course is Sharon. In this series, we've heard from Arti Kolra on Rabindranath Tagore, Laila Al-Hamad on the Arab focus on smell, Lagi Mama on the customary Moana perspective, Linda McIntosh on royalty in Laotian craft, Joseph Ndioni on the One Village, One Product movement, Hae-Young Cho on the role of universities in modern Korean craft, Ezra Shales on industrial craft in the US, a session with the Journal of Modern Craft on the mask as a pandemic craft, Patricia Flanagan on haptic interface, Professor Annie-Ying Chen on development of the Chinese workstation, Sachiko Tamashiga on Japanese mirror craft in ancient and modern Japan. Now, inspired by the discourse of our Tongan colleagues, we call on the previous speaker to make a salutation before we begin. And last time we had Liliana Moret with Sylvia Sasaoka presenting a wonderful talk about Mingue in Brazil. And I wonder if Liliana, you have some salutation you would like to share with us before we begin.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. So I would like to welcome and salute Sharon Tsang-de Lyster with a short poem by about the fall season by Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, and I will read it in my native language, and the original version should take about 40 seconds, so please bear with me. No entardecer da terra, o sopro do longo outono amareleceu o chão. Vago vento erra, como sonho mau num sono, na lívida solidão. Soergue as folhas e pousa, as folhas volve e revolve, vai-se ainda outra vez, mas a folha não repousa e o vento lívido volve, expira na lividez. Eu já não sou quem era, eu que eu sonhei morrio, e mesmo que hoje sou, amanhã direi, quem dera, volver a sê-lo, mais frio, o vento vago voltou. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Liliana, would you like to perhaps give us a brief summary of that poem?
It's a poem about the winter or the coming of the winter. So it's a poem about the fall and how it's getting darker and colder and feeling the wind coming and bringing the new season. Yes.
Good, thank you. And I guess we're bridging north and south now as you and others of the north are bracing yourself for the cold. We're warming up down south. So thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Sharon Tsang-de Lyster. She is a design anthropologist specializing in heritage textiles. In recent years, she has built up a wonderful set of online resources such as Narrative Made and the Textile Atlas that document world crafts and their stories. Sharon completed a master's at SOAS University of London and has been an active member of the Knowledge House for Craft. You can read a fascinating article, Joinful Palace Garden Restoration in the Ancient Now issue of Garland. Today she'll be presenting a timely paper, Crafts Enterprises as Empowerment for Refugees and Displaced People. It could be argued that Our understanding of the crafts is based on a notion of culture inherited from German Romanticism, that traditions spring from the soil. From this perspective, the situation of a refugee craftsperson who moves to a foreign land seems to compromise that authenticity. Yet refugees are not a purely modern phenomenon, and craftspersons have moved for other reasons, such as opportunities in courts, including Tipu Sultan's court in India that recruited artisans from across the world, including Europe. So with Sharon's talk, we have a chance to consider how craft assists in the transition to a new country, what kinds of craft tend to be practiced by displaced people, and whether something new emerges that makes a contribution to the field. So over to you, Sharon, and welcome.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be sharing with you all today. So I speak from the city of Hong Kong. So thank you for the welcome and the introduction. But I apologize for my voice as I'm still recovering from a cold. So I hope that I don't lose it halfway. So a bit more about this background of myself. My interest in craft has always had to do with the evolution of crafts throughout history, their makers and the intended purposes. And I try to engage in craft practices in ways that strengthen its role as social and economic development tool, as Kelvin mentioned. In the recent years, I've also been drawn to talented artisans who are in displacement, whether they are refugees or asylum seekers or nomadic groups. I used to travel with Narrative Mates projects, that is the design and research studio I run in my leisure time. It is now especially difficult to get it moving during a very strict travel restrictions in Hong Kong. So beyond the storytelling through one of my websites, the Textile Agnes, as mentioned, for the past year or so, I have had the privilege to focus more on helping artisans to expand their networks by distributing their products, because that's really what they need the most, especially during the pandemic. So today I want to explore the topic of displaced artisans and their crafts in displacement. What happens when the artisans are away from home, the original cultural context of their craft practices, and what happens to the craft itself during this process. Rather than studying each individual craft knowledge, I want to look into the context in which existing craft knowledge is allowed or encouraged to be kept alive in practice or evolving. Kelvin, if you don't mind helping me to share the presentation now. So I might just start here now. On the cover here is Najmi Karami, a mother of four, fled Afghanistan to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia due to military and political conflict. Bringing with her skillful hands in cross-stitching and crocheting, she has been working with social enterprise Earth Air to create beautiful jewelries. This work allows her to earn an income at home where she can take care of her young children and show them her creations. Next slide, please. So today, there is 84 million people have been forcefully displaced by war, violence, disasters, and persecution. This includes those who have been granted refugee status, those who are internally displaced, and those who might be referred to as asylum seekers. Back in 2009, I actually co-founded an NGO in Hong Kong to work with asylum seekers and refugee women on craft making. This was a little different to what I'll be sharing today, because in Hong Kong, without signing the 1951 Refugee Convention, under the local laws, these people are not permitted to work. Currently, Narrative Made partners with global artisan groups that employ refugees or displaced people living in their communities. So they are sort of all around the world. And I'll be giving around 10 examples of them in the rest of this presentation, depending on the time, all of which are makers of craft products that I stock and distribute. There is a wide ranging of context of craft and artisans' engagements here. I want to highlight the model of having enterprises as platforms for displaced artisans to preserve the practice of their cultural heritage, also for generating income to sustain their lives, not just relying on aid or being a burden to the host country, but to actually be co-workers with local communities. So it might be a bit more real, like a lot of the presentation information I'll be sharing are statistic to start with. Just want to always set the tone that refugees don't choose to move around, like they really have gone through trauma, and most of the time are really just living for survival now in their engagement with crafts. So that might be less romantic, but that's what we're going to look into crafts today. So let's start our mini world tour. If you can go to the next slide, please. So first, we're going to Thailand. Based in Chiang Mai, the NGO Thai Tribal Crafts has been working with tribal people in northern Thailand for decades. Along the border, they work with the Karen people who moved from Myanmar and the Mien people who moved from Laos and a few other hill tribes. The background of the Karen group is all about survival and conflicts with the central Myanmar government. For many decades, this situation has generated a flow of migration at the Thai-Myanmar border. Many Karen people live as unregistered refugees in Thailand with politicized problems or issues attached, including not giving recognition of their indigenous culture within the country. As the Karen seek their independence, their textiles are not integrated into either Thai or Burmese textile cultures. To build national parks, the Thai national government recently reclaimed the forest land previously owned by the Karen. Handicrafts now become one of the main income sources. So next slide, please. Another group is the Mien people, a subgroup of the Yao, who migrated from China a long time ago and now living across China, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Laos. And note that these reference of countries are also using modern borders, I guess, for the territories reference. They are known for their neat geometric embroidery and silver jewelry. Picture here is the Mien embroidery and the Karen weaving. Engaging with Thai tribal crafts is the main connection to the broader Thai society in the remote hillside. The crafts in displacement have over the decades evolved to fit their current living, but because of their isolated environment, they have largely kept to the traditional techniques. The main drive to the changes in design and in some cases the materials of add-on components is really the commercialization of the products. The craft is sold in regional markets in Chiang Mai, Chiang Rai, and are exported through Thai tribal crafts. Next, we're going to Malaysia. Accessories brand Earth Air has included Rohingya refugee women in its production line. The brand supports traditional craftspeople with holistic ethical operations, including education, collaborative design partnerships, supply chain training, market access, financial support, and fair trade commercial practices. Earth Air works collaboratively with the artisan partners to preserve their heritage craft skills for the future. They train their artisans to raise both their skills and the value of the heritage pieces. Asylum seekers in Malaysia have no legal status, and they wait on average 13 years before they are permanently resettled by UNHCR in a country more welcoming to them. During these years, it is crucial that they have the opportunity to continually develop and contribute to society. Next slide, please. So here, Rashida arrived in Malaysia as a widowed Rohingya woman from the Myanmar's Arakan state. She learned English, Arabic, and Malay through the Rohingya Women Development Network, the RWDN, and was connected to Earth Air. Here, she's making tassels for UNHCR's brand Made 51 Ornaments collection. Grateful for the opportunity to make a living and be equipped with new skills, she said, back in Myanmar, women are not allowed to work and they don't wear accessories. No one appreciates the beauty of jewelry and accessories. In Malaysia, women are allowed to work and everyone lives happily. I want to point out that one of the motivations for craft making for these refugee women is clearly for financial independence. But in Rashida's case, it seems like craft making was not an appreciated activity for her before her displacement. Our Afghan cover girl, who also actually worked in this group, it is about her mental health as well. She said, when she's stitching, I don't think about my problems. The income helps me support my family and my children. Her young children also get to witness how she works and potentially learn the same skills. So NGO like RWDN that empowers and helps with the integration of refugees in the host country also play a big part in this refugee and enterprise partnership. Next. Even before this year's crisis, long-time conflicts has left millions of Afghans fleeing their home for safety. They are the largest protracted refugee population in Asia and the second largest refugee population in the world. So displaced Afghans play a key role in keeping their rich cultural heritage alive, from music to calligraphy to ceramics and textile crafts such as embroidery and carpet making. Across the surrounding countries in India, Malaysia, and Pakistan, Afghan refugee artisans have been working with local businesses to design, make, and market their crafts. I will highlight two groups in India. So next slide, please. Fine needlework and crochet work are some of the signature heritage textiles techniques from Afghanistan. Shashi is a brand that specializes in fine crochet accessories, especially with metallic threads made by well-trained Afghan craftswomen. One of the asylum seeker employees said, "I'm very glad to use artisan skills from my home country. It is one of our main sources of livelihood in India." Besides their year-round crocheting of bridal accessories, the brand also makes ornaments for May 51. The brand owner said that the ornament order helped to include more refugees in the production line, giving them livelihood and economic sustainability during this COVID time. Next slide, please. So Salawali is another enterprise based in Delhi in India. Their handmade doll collection addressed some of the world's most pressing issues, that is waste from the textile industry and the livelihood of the displaced individuals. The brand takes production waste from the city's garment factories as raw materials and employ Afghan refugee women to hand sew each character together with fine finishing and embroideries. Next slide. Their dolls are very well distributed around the world and have collaborated with global fashion brands using their production waste to create customized dolls. I had the privilege of bringing these dolls to Hong Kong for a local NGO's fundraising campaign. The Hong Kong Dignity Institute provides integrated legal and psychosocial support to victims of trafficking, refugees, and asylum seekers. So these refugee-made dolls are great advocates for the issue of displaced people and who are really have their own skills in their own ways, and they're all talented individuals. This Christmas, Dignity Institute is publishing 2 children's books based on the dolls made by Salawali. It is very exciting. Together with the craft dolls, it is a wonderful education tool. And if any of you are interested, please let me know. It's coming up in 2 weeks' time. Here in the picture, you can see like on the left, places where they find all the production waste from factories around Delhi, and the workshop with the woman on the right. Can I have next slide, please? Okay, next, this is my absolute favorite. Kiswa specializes in intricately embroidered pillows made by women in the Rashida a refugee camp outside of Tyre in South Lebanon. This camp was created in the 1930s to house Armenian refugees. In 1984, it started housing Palestinian refugees and currently also houses some Syrian refugees. So Kiswa's pillowcases are inspired by the rich traditional Palestinian needlework motifs. You can go to the next slide. The motifs are passed down through generations and are associated with the specific villages and regions of origin. They might represent trees, gardens, precious objects, rural scenes, and religious beliefs. Coming from a land of pilgrims and of spice and silk trade routes, these motifs hold rich history of symbolism and influences from around the world. If you can look here, the book on the top right are some of the reference of their traditional motifs, and the team would create some more modern or bring out parts of it to create a modernized version that still brings out the same message or the same kind of meanings from the motifs to build into the new pattern. And in the next slide, you will see a little bit more, and I'll tell you a bit more about the process. So the designs are developed by the team in Lebanon. Then the embroidery coordinators will meet with the women at the camp to discuss the models, materials, and distribute the work. From the paper-based design, which you saw in the last slide, a more experienced embroiderer would pass the design on the canvas. No pattern is printed on the canvas, so this process really tests the needleworker's memory and the logic of the designs. Then the woman with distributed work would complete the whole embroidery at home. The finished pieces are brought to a sewing workshop in Beirut to be made into pillowcases. The needlework is spotless, and I'm glad to see us focus products range still incorporating heritage skills and motifs executed so well, while giving these Palestinian refugees a livelihood. We'll go to the next destination. So in Armenia, approximately 40% of the population lives in some level of poverty. HDIF is a social enterprise that is committed to handicraft production and craft tourism in the country, working with many partners in Armenia. They support 5 different groups of Syrian Armenian refugees on embroidery and felting. Next slide, please. On the left of the presentation is Mara, who came to Armenia with her family from Syria in 2015. She started a small handicraft business, which has begun its wholesale production with the support of HDIF. It is all done in communities and in homes. And they share really nice cakes and scones in their meetings. Here, the group is making felt decorations from local wool, which is a known Armenian craft, and decorating them with the mirage embroidery. The mirage cords, which I hope that I said it right, is a form of embroidery popular among the Armenians of the mirage city, done by weaving the service pattern through a 2-rows lace-like framework. This piece you see here at the corner, the bottom corner, is from the collection of the Armenian Museum of America. Although this embroidery is now extinct in Mirage due to the Armenian genocide, it is still practiced by Armenian women throughout the diaspora. Here, refugees moved back from Syria are continuing the practice and preserving the culture. Next. Next, yeah. Millions of people have fled Syrian through since 2011, seeking safety in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and beyond. Both BB Boss in Turkey and tight-knit Syria in Netherlands are working with displaced Syrians. BB Boss was started by a French expat living in Istanbul who wanted to engage with refugee moms to produce crocheted soft toys. They provide the little ones a play area in the workshop, making work more accessible to displaced women who have child caring duties. Currently, they're working with 80 knitters at a community center. Since the brand is catering to the international market, it focuses on creating new characters of stuffed toys with basic crochet stitches. It is easy to include new members of artisans, but less focus on creating crafts according to their heritage designs. You can see some of the products on this slide. And we can go to the next slide, please. With working opportunities, especially hard to come by during the pandemic and since the tragic explosion that happened in Beirut last August, Tight Knit Syria is involving and empowering refugee artisans in multiple ways. They are involving them in the very earliest stages of product development, from design to sourcing around the city of Beirut, and have them manage the logistics of the production and international shipping. This really deepens their connections with the local community, making them effective members of the society and train them up for operations of the business. Next page, please. So we're moving to the final continent of Africa, and I'll start with basket weaving. So basket weaving remains one of the most long-lasting crafts in East Africa. The enduring role of basketry tradition is an art form for both functions and aesthetic beauty. Baskets are used for all sorts of purposes, storing grain, flour, and small household objects. Baskets are also used in weddings and other celebrations. They are placed on the head and used to carry presents to the event for the bride and the groom. In recent decades, handmade basketry is increasingly replaced by plastic containers. As a result, this heritage craft is less invested in for the everyday objects. Since 2015, political unrest has driven over 300,000 Burundians out of their country for safety. This refugee situation is one of the lowest funded of any displacement situations. Burundi refugees in Tanzania, Rwanda, and the DRC arrived to find camps full and only temporary shelters available. However, it is in these camps that we find a lot of well-established craft enterprises. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see women craft at the Tanzania-Burundi border organizes refugee artisans to weave baskets. Artisans use whatever is available and continue to practice a craft that they learned since very young. Sweetgrass strands are bundled together and bound with fiber from the grain sacks left over from food distribution in the camps, which you can see in the bottom left, the white ones. So they would take them apart and then use them to become the fiber to wrap around the sweetgrass. As the length of the bundle is wrapped, it's worked into a spiral as the center of the basket. Many refugees worked here and saved up enough to rebuild their lives when they returned to Burundi. Some actually moved nearby to the border to continue working with the brand. So this displacement and the craft intervention actually also created new movement within the Burundian population. Another brand, Indigo Africa, works with Burundian artisans in the Mahama refugee camp in Rwanda in units of cooperatives. So they weave baskets from hand-dyed sizzle and sweetgrass. The brand also runs a vocational and business training program, facilitating saving groups among refugees artisans to offer more holistic empowerment. Some of these co-ops have even gone to start their own businesses, and you can read more in details on the Textile Atlas. These two examples show that with a solid connection to the international market, the craft sustains in some of the most traditional forms and can bring large-scale social impact. Next slide. I won't actually have time to go into all the examples from Africa today, but you can read more again on the published stories. So this is that includes metalwork craft by Torang refugees living in Niger and those from Mali living in Burkina Faso. The next slide, you will see Torang craftsmen in Burkina Faso making metal tableware and ornaments with the social enterprise Africa test. And then the next one is Torang craft woman weaving onto the metal pieces to make lampshades for AAKS. So this is when the two genders can really work together to create some of these products, and they really needed the designer AAKS to come about and think of what are the products that was not a traditional craft that's made within this community, but can use the craft skills and the knowledge from multiple members of the community. And next slide, please. So one more non-textile example. This is the freehand carving, wood carving from Congolese refugees. This is Kappa in Nairobi in Kenya. He's part of the team at Social Enterprise Mafuku. And the next slide, you can see a bit more of the process. His practice of wood carving was inspired and learned from his father. Every year, the team craft over 2,000 birds from locally sourced, really fast-growing trees. So there are more. This is sort of the end. If you go to the next slide, is my last slide. There are more stories on the textile artness, and you can also see the products of, the end products of some of these mentioned craft initiatives and craftspeople. In an age where we are more informed about the world issues and the power of our consumption, I believe that supporting refugee-made crafts is an effective way to help certain crafts cultures and heritage to sustain and strive, let alone supporting these individuals in hardship. That's all from me today. I hope you find these crafts practice examples encouraging as much as I do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that wonderful and very broad view of refugees from so many different parts of the world.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And it's great to understand the complexity of it. You've clearly got to know these projects in detail personally, so have an idea of the very different manifestations of refugee craft. Now we have some time to talk about what we've just heard. So does anyone have any questions or comments for Sharon that they'd like to make? Ben.
Hey Sharon, thanks a million for all these examples, and there's so much there that I guess you could speak for an hour about each one of them independently. And I was super curious about the way that the refugees who come in contact with these social enterprise organize themselves. And it seems that through the examples that you've given, there's different ways that labor and responsibilities has been distributed. And I was wondering whether, out of the many examples that you described, you sense that there was a better way to do things and a better way to allow some freedom in establishing labor distribution, responsibility, assignment, initiative, also, to shift the position of the workers from workers to entrepreneurs, which in a couple of cases seems to be happening. In other words, I'm curious about the labor aspect of the examples that you described.
Yeah, I think, as I said, there is a wide-ranging context here. You see across the different examples, and whether the refugees are living in camps make a big difference. Because if they're in camps, they're physically quite restricted in where they can go and how they interact with the broader society. Not all camps are, like closed off, but I think there is quite a life and a huge community within big scale camps. And that shaped how the refugees' understanding of their lives in the current state and how they want to engage with anything, including crafts. So I would say that definitely there are a lot of rooms for improvement in terms of whether, the giving agency to the craftspeople kind of perspective. But what I have been seeing through all these examples is that if the enterprise is the ones who want to give respect and want to include crafts people from the very beginning of the brainstorming process, and to allow them to take ownership of the actual design and the production and the crafts, then it shapes the whole dynamic quite differently. So I don't know whether it kind of answer your question. I do see, there are different examples here, and the ones that I've highlighted have definitely the enterprises have a heart for the people and the crafts. That's why they're engaging in slightly more, not top-down way, but in terms of logistical management and still running them as businesses, is that there needs a certain system in place. And they're just training in times you see they're training these individuals to become the managers within those like co-ops or workshops. I think one example that I mentioned towards the end in Rwanda, where Indigo Africa works with artisans co-ops, allow it to be a bit more flexible, because each co-ops can come up with their designs, can come up with their ideas of how to run the actual group business, and then the international facing enterprise, which is Indigo Africa, can be the liaison to the export, but they don't interfere too much in terms of how they make it or the design of the baskets.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Joseph, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, hi. Sharon, thank you for sharing. I mean, it's really inspiring and encouraging. So congratulations in your work. Just one question. In terms of refugees, there's of course the response and relief, recovery, rehabilitation, and rebuilding aspects. So the project I was involved with, I mean, unfortunately, they told me that they're still under the relief and recovery phase. So it's they're still suffering from trauma, for example, and they're still insecure in their, in your experience, how long does it take? I mean, in an estimate, I suppose it's different for different communities and the trauma that they have suffered. Is that how long in your experience does it take for them to transit from, let's say, recovery from rehabilitation, where they can actually engage in empowerment and assurance and confidence building activities?
I'm tended to support the idea that things all happen in parallel. So I don't think from my personal friendships with refugees and asylum seekers are mainly in Hong Kong, but some in during my time in the UK. Trauma stays with you. Like, people have a lived experience of something that is traumatic, they stay with you all their lives. It's how you continue to process it, and the new experience that built onto how you make sense of the past, that sometimes can change that narrative. So in terms of maybe development program way of thinking, then there is this graduation of stages, and there needs to be from an external perspective. But I think for the individuals, they probably are just going through things that's a bit more ready for interaction with external on the next phase. It's not that, like, for example, I feel like the freshly traumatized refugees or, been just forcefully displaced, it's not that they're not able to engage with an opportunity to use crafts and to empower oneself, or to make something and sell right away and give them the 2 cents that will bring them to the next destination. They might probably do that, but the mental state of why they like engaging with such activity would be not what we call the livelihood part, right? So I think yeah, there's a mixture probably in how different groups handle it, and also there are a lot of refugees that are now living in the urban setting, and for them actually doing crafts work is barely viable. So because the living condition or the living cost in the new neighborhoods will be so high that maybe it's very hard unless you have a very good system, such as these really strong partners who can be the employer to make sense, and they're normally not based right in the center of a city, right? So and the only sort of workable examples that I shared today is the dolls, that they are quite in New Delhi, they're quite central, but because they have a very standard output, which is actually not so much on heritage crafts, but using craft skills to create modern items that they're serving completely the international market. The purpose of the individuals to engage with that workshop will be completely different already. These are the people over the years I've seen being also able to share and in front of media very eloquently, compared with some of the other examples, say in the Burundi and Burundi border. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'm learning every day as well from everyone.
I wonder if I could come in here.
Oh, sorry.
Is there somebody speaking?
Kevin, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, Layla Al-Hamad.
Hi.
Yes.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Sure. Sorry, I didn't I interrupted you. Usually you can tell if somebody is about to ask by them going on to unmute. So
Yes,
but
sorry
please
about that.
go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I just have a few questions, which are also perhaps more clarifications. Some of the groups that you presented, were they already, so some of the women perhaps in the Middle East, Afghanistan, were they already artisans? I mean, was that their livelihood before they became refugees, or crafts became their livelihoods once they became refugees? And two, and I'm thinking here specifically of a situation I encountered in Jordan, where there were Syrian craftsmen, in this case, there were men who were craftsmen in the art of woodworking, exceptional craftsmen, who became refugees they were Syrian refugees in Jordan. And when they set up their own workshops, it created tensions in the community, because in a way their skills were so elevated that it created tensions among the Jordanian woodworkers, who were more, let's say, carpenters rather than artisans. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about perhaps if you've encountered any tensions, and whether in a way some of these crafts are kept alive because of the refugee status of some of these individuals, or they were taken up because of their new condition. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Lila. Yeah, so the first question, most of the refugees highlighted in this presentation, it's hard to say whether craft was their livelihood beforehand. Most of the time, their crafts background is that they do it at home, and they would do it anyways as part of a cultural practice. And if it's women, then most of the time they don't have another job, so the main duties is taking care of family, and then they also practice crafts to make things for the home, for kids, etc. So I would say majority of what I'm seeing is that crafts becomes the livelihood when in these contexts, there are limited ways to find livelihood, and that if they find opportunity through enterprise, for example, who can do export for them or can, actually do sales for them, then that just became their livelihood, or income source, if that's what you mean. And attention, I think definitely they will. Actually, I don't think the crafts skills and practice is the main source of tension, right? And probably everyone can agree to that, between migrants and refugees and asylum seekers to a lot of the host communities and countries. But if you're talking about comparing and having to share the market, then I can imagine, that would bring, new layers of tensions. But I have been seeing almost none of that in my own experience. So I'm hoping that this is a minority. But also I feel like some of the most heartwarming examples or quotes and interviews that I've done, even through remotely, is interviewing the business, like not contractor, like the external partners to complete the operation of these enterprises, who are people who originally from their host communities. So for example, the pillow brand, the Kiswa that I mentioned, the embroideries are done by refugees in the camp, and they are then brought out to workshops, local workshops in Beirut, to make them into pillows. So in a way, they complete each other in the production line. And there is a lot more collaboration could happen if everyone see their role in making something happen, making the products completed. So I'm hoping that those stories and those experiences can be spread wider as well.
Thank you. Tineke, did you have something you wanted to raise?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this presentation. It's really insightful and lovely to see that there's, the diversity of work that's being done and the focus on this, because, I appreciate that the economic livelihood of the women and their families is, or the craftsmen people and their families is really very dire in a refugee situation. And in addition, finding a new market and materials that are can work away from their homes is another challenge. So I'm interested in hearing what exactly the interaction is. Is it workshops? How does that matching happen to how do you develop your skills as a maker to suit that new market? What design ideas are honoring the traditional and still help to find a market? So what exactly are the interactions that happen to help this process?
So you're asking about how they get paired, like how people found the businesses. I feel, I think all of them have different stories. The ones that operate within refugee camps are very likely that the brand founder have a vision to engage with this group of people who have very specific skills already, whether embroidery or basket weaving. And because with refugee camps is kind of monitored by UNHCR, so there is a more institutional facing liaison, sort of say, to help these conversations get going and to organize the woman or the man to get paired up. And most of the time I can see that it's starting from some more empowerment training it doesn't necessarily guarantee any output in those activities, and eventually become part of co-ops or working with these enterprises. So the example in Malaysia is really from the training given from an NGO partner to get the refugees sort of ready to get engaged, and then they introduce the different businesses to the right refugees who have the right skills to do something with them. So I think there are these sort of examples. The ones who are not in camps, I think actually displaced people do find communities and stick together anyways, wherever they go, because they really need that support network. So in Delhi, in India, the ones that who made dolls, there are already a significant group of Afghan women who are supporting each other, and they live in proximity. And the couple who started Silawali then got connected with maybe one or two of them and started this whole idea of how can we actually the main objective they started the brand was to upcycle waste from the garment factories, but at the same time they also get connected to this group of very skillful needle worker from Afghanistan. So that became the majority of the sort of workers in the workshop, and that just became a life of its own, and all the work that they do is advocating for Afghan refugees now.
Thanks, Sharon. We're coming to the end of the hour. I just wonder if I could slip in a question finally, which is about the outward facing nature of refugee craft, and the sense in which for many, the story of the refugee is something which comes along with the product, and particularly if it's going to appear in something like Oxfam shops. So being made by a refugee gives value in many cases. I think perhaps particularly with products like dolls, which often are associated with stories. And but I wonder, in your experience, have you ever come across situations where this has been exploited? I mean, we think about greenwashing, where there's sort of fake environmental value, and there's a kind of craft washing sometimes where something made with love by hand is done in a sweatshop. Is there a have you come across situations, particularly given that refugees are quite vulnerable, where there's been exploitation? And I guess part of the rationale for your platform is to try and weed out those and select examples that you think are authentic. But have you come across ones that have raised questions?
I think generally refugees have very limited rights and have very, like, on a legal basis, they really have little that they can fight for. Or I mean, I'm not expert in the legal perspective, but I've been really close and worked with some human rights lawyers who have been advising me on these kind of research projects as well. And I find that definitely, I think most of the time refugees are exploited in multiple ways. If it's coming to the neighboring aspect, like what they made, then I think it's the storytelling side is for external audience. For them, what primarily concerns them is the crediting the wages. And so the key or the priority for me to look at how legit or how worthy of supporting for any of these operations is what is the neighbor payment structure or the engagement and protection with the refugees, craftspeople. And if they are part of the May 51 network, and I can be assured that it is very safe because that network was built with the WFTO as the implementing partner to set the living wage and the fair living wage for each country where the refugees are now living in. So they would be closely monitored in a way. The ones who are outside of that particular network, then any of them outside, actually I've personally have visited them and get to know them to at least understand their intention, and the way that they do empowerment and engagement is beyond that kind of object exchange. It's not a transactional relationship. And I think that is actually tracking back, like my main, the starting point of why I even got into artisan crafts was through my interest in development programs. Like, how do people in poverty get interaction with outside, so interventions or different sort of programs, then, you know, what is the different NGOs' perspectives and their way of operating. And so asking questions that lead me to understand the sort of the vision and the posture of these people who's on the other side as the refugees would help me get a better sense. But sure, like there's no real matrix for me to answer that question and say who takes the box, who doesn't. It's something that yet to be developed, and I think it will be great to see that coming through in the coming years, because refugee population is growing by doubling by year nowadays. So we are going to have huge population of the world who are no longer under I guess the setting of the home, the structure, the own country's legal protection systems. Where do they find their rights? Like, there's actually a lot of missing piece in the policy needs to be happen.
Well,
Sure.
thank you so much.
Answer your question.
Yes. Well, I think you've really given us a very complex understanding of the refugee craft situation, the dynamic with the host country, the relationships with each other, the coping with the experience of displacement. And I think underlying it all is the importance of work of people like you to be able to convey that information so that it doesn't necessarily fit into stereotypes that can eventually become something that people think is like a do-gooder narrative, that it overlooks some of the authenticity of it. I think finding ways of, through photography, as you did with us in this session, and the story is especially important and a great way of conveying knowledge in the knowledge house.
Well,
So,
I just want to, sorry, just one more comment to hopefully give another perspective to what we were talking about. One of the reasons that I have no longer worked with the refugees in Hong Kong is that because under certain law, like in Hong Kong, these operations are not possible. They're not allowed to work and you cannot pay them. So not that you cannot engage with displaced people, but then it completely framed that intention and what people get out of it, and how refugees see their worth and see the value of their crafts and skills completely differently. And as of this moment, I'm still trying to work with Dignity Institute, the NGO that I mentioned, to actually roll out a craft program in Hong Kong for refugees, but not as production chain sort of operation, but as an empowerment thing. We can't even do trainings in Hong Kong. Training is illegal to refugees. So there's many, I think in each kind of local context, there is really a lot of things needs to be worked out, but that is exactly the complexity of the issues that we're talking about. I'm just really thankful that I get to share the very small knowledge that I do have. Like, many of these examples are inspiration for myself, and I wish that I can see them and meet them all myself, but I haven't. So one day.
well, I think that last incident, Sharon, reminds us that one important role we can play is to be a conduit for the Woodcraft Council and to put refugees on its agenda so it can use its relations with other governments particularly the Chinese government, to advocate for their rights. So we'll take that up, certainly. Now, in just a couple of weeks' time, we've got the next conversation, which is to coincide with the latest issue of the Journal of Modern Craft, which has some fascinating articles, and we'll be hearing from Forrest Perdue about the history of French craft in the 20th century, and also from Xu Wu in China about the changing nature of craft between the Qing and the Ming dynasties. And underlying that is the question of whether craft is something radical, whether it's something which represents development and change, or whether it is essentially conservative, holding back to try and stick with existing traditions. So it'll be very interesting to get different perspectives of that in the next conversation. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for your comments. Thanks so much, Sheshe, Sharon, for a wonderful and inspiring talk. Go well, everyone.
Thank you so much.